Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name's Tom Lundy. I direct the Reverend Michael C. McFarland S.J. Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, which sponsors programs like today's that explore issues of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Two images, really two places, came to mind as I was preparing and thinking about today's lecture. The first was Coimbra in Portugal. If you've been there, you know that Coimbra is a very much a down-on-its-heels city. The once was home to a famous Jesuit university, which is now a state university. I remember a guidebook, I think it was the Michelin Guide, that actually said straight out that for Coimbra it's all been downhill since the Marquis de Pombal threw the Jesuits out in 1759. That's a long time to go downhill, I want to point out. It is still the case, though, that the most magnificent buildings and the things that I remember seeing most are those remnants of the Jesuit college and university. The cathedral there today was the Formation House Church. The second place I think of is Guanajuato in Mexico, also home to a gorgeous 18th century university and church. When I saw it the first time, I marveled at the architectural accomplishment of it in the high desert of Mexico, and then suddenly noticed that it was built in 1767, which is to say the same year that the Spanish suppression of the Jesuits came about. I tried to wrap my head around what it must have been like for the Jesuits to have just completed such a magnificent complex, only to see it swept away in one night with their arrest and deportation. That story can be repeated in many cities on many continents. You go to many small towns in Europe, and you'll look up and you'll see the seal of the society on some public building. Many of the best schools and cultural institutions were run by the Jesuits, and such extraordinary accomplishment was undone fairly quickly. This year, Holy Cross joins other Jesuit institutions around the globe to mark the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the Society of Jesus, after the Jesuits were originally suppressed by Pope Clement XIV in 1773. Holy Cross would not be here, of course, without that restoration. But before our celebration of the restoration, today's a chance to look at what happened that brought about the suppression, what happened during the time of the suppression. We're fortunate to have the scholar Robert Maryks to speak to us about the causes and history of the suppression. Robert is a visiting scholar at the Jesuit Institute at Boston College, where he's organizing a conference on Jesuit survival and restoration, the 200th anniversary perspectives, in June. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Jesuit Studies and of Brill's series of Jesuit studies. He's co-editor with Jonathan Wright of the forthcoming Jesuit Survival and Restoration. Robert has written monographs including St. Cicero and the Jesuits, Catholic Christendom 1300 to 1700, and The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews, Jesuits and Jewish Ancestry and Purity of Blood Laws in the Early Society of Jesus. He's also written Pouring Jewish Water into Fascist Wine, Untold Stories of Catholic Jews from the archive of Mussolini's Jesuit Pietro Tacci Venturi. He's also published a number of book chapters, journal articles, and reviews. Please join me in welcoming Robert Maryks.
Good afternoon. I would like to start with a citation from Voltaire. When we have destroyed the Jesuits, we shall have easy work with the infâme. And infâme in Voltairean vocabulary means the Catholic Church. And I think I might finish my lecture already by pointing out that this is the cause of the Jesuit suppression, but it turns out that the Jesuit suppression was much more complex and complicated process. And this afternoon, I would like to focus on the part of Jesuit of the process of Jesuit suppression, which took place in Portugal, because this is a part of that history that I explored more, and I can say here this afternoon something original, I think. But before I do so, I would like to introduce you to the topic and contextualize, because I think that one of the most important aspects of understanding Jesuit suppression is to understand the historical context within which that process took place. Is that fine? Is the plan sounds good? All right, so let's go forward. So that would be a plan of a complete lecture on Jesuit suppression. I would start with the 18th century historical context. Then we could actually divide causes into immediate causes and long-run causes. Now, most of the accounts of Jesuit suppression that we have talk about immediate causes, right? So we have a narrative of national suppressions in Bourbon monarchies in Portugal, 1759, France, 1764, Spain, 1767, and satellites, Spanish satellites, Naples and Parma, 67, 68, and the final general papal suppression of 1773. Right? So just to have a more immediate historical context. Now, what is, I think, very important to understand, and maybe in a conversation this afternoon, because there is no complete and satisfying narrative of the Jesuit suppression yet. So maybe if we discuss some of the long-run causes this afternoon in this exchange, we might point out to Jesuit Institute itself and the supranational structure of the Society of Jesus. So I might dare offering a thesis that the suppression of the Society of Jesus in the 18th century was caused by the way the Society of Jesus was actually founded. So in the foundation itself, I think they were already the seeds of the future suppression. We'll see it later. Then ultramontanism, which is a theory of stressing the papal authority over the authority of princes and monarchs. Then probabilism and accommodation. Probabilism was a Jesuit moral doctrine that actually was not invented by the Jesuits, even though people like Pascal would argue that, but it was the Dominicans from the school of Salamanca who came up with the doctrine of probabilism, but the Jesuits embraced that doctrine and made it their own. And especially in the first half of the 17th century, probabilism became the dominant moral doctrine of the Jesuits. Now, probabilism was, as you might know, opposed strongly, viciously, I might say, by Jansenists. Right? And Jansenist opposition to Jesuits because of their doctrine of probabilism, again, is one of the leading causes of the Jesuit suppression. So even though the Jansenist attack took place in the mid-17th century, all right, Pascal's provincial letters were published in mid-17th century, but Jansenists as a political group survived in France for many decades after Pascal, and many of the members of the French parliament that actually pushed for the suppression of the Jesuits in France were Jansenists. But not only that, there was a very strong Jansenist group in Rome itself. And in mid-18th century, where there was this all very anti-Jesuit atmosphere in Bourbon courts, European courts, there was a very strong group of Jansenists within the papal curia. And they pushed, together with other people that I will introduce soon, to suppress the society. So definitely, now again, Jansenist opposition to the Jesuits was born as an opposition to a moral school of theology, but it became a political party that was extremely anti-Jesuit. Another part is accommodation. Again, Jansenists criticized Jesuit accommodation as well, so the entire problem with the Chinese and Malabar rights, okay, again, would play a significant role because Jesuits were accused of being too accommodating to the local cultures, especially in China or in India. Okay, and those who opposed that were especially the Dominicans. And again, there's a long-run history of Dominican Jesuit conflict. And we can discuss it later as well. And finally, I think that the Jesuit myth play a very significant role. Why? Because we will see that the suppression of the Society of Jesus in the 18th century was obtained through propaganda and manipulation. All right? The image of the Jesuits that especially the French philosophers were able to create was based not on reality, at least not 100% on reality, but on biases that had been formed through the history of the Society of Jesus from the very beginning. All right. So that will be a complete lecture, but obviously you will not bear me for so long. So I will make some selections and we'll see where we can arrive. All right. First of all, let's look at the Bourbon family pact. So we are still within the 18th century historical context. Why is that important? Bourbon family pact, 1761. Now, those of you who study history, 1761 is within what war that was taking place in Europe? Anybody? I can see students here. 1761. There's a European dynastic war that affected also North America because France, because of that war, lost off much of its territory to England. It was called the 7 Years' War. And this pact was made between France and Spain and Spanish satellite states, exactly originally against England, all right? But then that pact was used to coordinate the policy of Bourbon courts, especially in the final stage when they were making pressure on the suppression of the Society of Jesus by the Pope. All right. So we have Louis XV. This is the first actor here. Then we have Ferdinand VI and Charles III in Spain. You have the dates. So you see the dates correspond to those national suppressions that I pointed out before, right? Ferdinand VI died 1759, which is the year in which Portugal suppressed the Jesuits, right? And just a few years before, Jesuits were suppressed in Spain in 1764. Then we have the satellite states, Naples, and then Parma. And I have one example of how that worked, which is conflict between Duke of Parma, which was, again, the satellite state, and Clement XIII in 1768. So what happened? The Duke of Parma issued a series of ordinances against the church. In response, Pope Clement pronounced these decrees to be null and void. The Bourbon interpreted this as a papal attack on temporary princes. Right? So we have here a conflict between the spiritual and temporal powers. A long conflict, again, but which exploded somehow in the 18th century, also because of the Enlightenment, as we will see very soon. A few months later, France and Naples made reprisals against the Pope. Neapolitan troops took the papal towns of Benevento and Pontecorvo, while the French took Avignon and Venaissin. All right, so you see, very specific example how this Bourbon family pact would work. All right, So if they do not agree with the papal politics, well, they take papal territory. So it was very serious pact and had impact on European politics. Are we good up to here? Actually, if you have questions as we go forward, please raise your hand, and I will be happy to explain if something is not clear. All right. So I understand we can go forward. So then we have papacy, just very briefly, Clement XIII, and again I start with 1758 because the Portuguese suppression is 59. So we are within the pontificate of Clement XIII, and then his successor, Clement XIV. Now, Clement XIII, his original name was Carlo della Torre Rezzonico. He was from Venice. He was born in 1693 in Venice. He was educated by the Jesuits in Bologna, and that explains to some extent why Clement XIII defended the Jesuits in this period. All right. So, as you can see, he began his reign in 58. So he went through the all national suppressions, and yet he resisted very strongly the general suppression, in spite of continuous pressure on him by the especially Bourbon monarchs. All right. Now, Clement XIV, whose name was Giovanni Vincenzo Antonio Lorenzo, because he was a Franciscan friar, so when he entered the Franciscans, he took the name of Lorenzo. Ganganelli was his last name. He was born near Rimini in 1705. Again, he had received education from the Jesuits, but also from Pyrrhus in Urbino. So again, he had sympathies toward the Jesuits, but as we will see, he succumbed to the pressures and eventually issued in 1773 a brief, Dominus ac Redemptor, which suppressed the Jesuits worldwide. In the corresponding period, so between 1758, so now that this is the same date when Clement XIII began his pontificate, the Superior General of the Jesuits is Lorenzo Ricci, an Italian, okay, who will be incarcerated by Clement XIV 2 months after the promulgation of the brief, and he will die in the Castle Sant'Angelo. If you have been in Rome, it's a beautiful castle near the Vatican. And he would die in 73, not in 75. He died 75, 2 years after the suppression, general suppression of the society. All right. All right, so what are, again, we are still within the 18th century historical context. What are the important dates here, events that took place? First of all, we have in 1750, Treaty of Madrid. Now, how many of you have seen the movie The Mission? Most of you, of course. It's a very interesting movie. And exactly the episode that the movie is based on is the Treaty of Madrid, which defined the spheres of influence between Portugal and Spain in South America, so established a new border, all right, so that some of the Jesuit so-called reducciones, or reductions, missions, became Portuguese territory, all right, and there was a resistance of Guarani Indians to that new political map, and as a consequence, in 56, there was a War of 7 Reductions. Okay, War of 7 Reductions. Now, how many of you have read Voltaire's Candide? A little bit less, okay. Again, I recommend it because to understand the anti-Jesuitism of 18th century and how the philosophers or the French Enlightenment approached the Jesuits, Candide is fundamental. It's fundamental. And if you remember, Cacambo goes to visit exactly the missions in Paraguay, and we have a portrayal of missions, right? So we have the superior of the mission who is an officer, okay? Because Voltaire portrays the Jesuit fathers in the missions as military order, right? Which was not true, but again, it was part of the myth to propose of the Society of Jesus as a kind of troops that were in rebellion against the Spanish or Portuguese monarchs in South America. Now, also please note that in the meantime, in Europe, between 51 and 72, we have Encyclopedia, which was a major work, especially by Diderot, one of the French philosophers. So, as you can see, in this period we have, now Encyclopedia contained many articles on the Jesuits. Most of them were very negative articles, including an article on Jesuit moral philosophy, on probabilism. Okay. Now, I already mentioned before, 56 to 63, 7 Years' War. So I introduced already why it was important. Although there's another element of this, because in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, all the belligerents face pressing needs for more money to fund the growing armies, to organize navies, to wage overseas conflicts, and to counter the impact of inflation. To make tax increases more palatable to public opinion, rulers, monarchs, appointed reform-minded ministers and gave them a mandate to modernize government. And we will see very soon what kind of role these reform-minded ministers played in the suppression of the Jesuits. So again, you might think that 7 Years' War has no connection to the Jesuit suppression, but I do believe that there is a very important connection to be made. Again, note, Voltaire's Candide is published in 59, just 1 year after the suppression of the Jesuits in Portugal, and just 5 years before the suppression of the Jesuits in France. All right? So between Encyclopedia and Voltaire's Candide, you can understand that the French public opinion was being prepared, right, with this very negative portrayal of the Jesuits. Now, some might question to what extent Encyclopedia or Voltaire's Candide actually did influence the public opinion, but again, I will come back to it, and I will try to argue that even though the Enlightenment was kind of elitarian movement, and for sure it did not affect people in large numbers, right? But it was a movement that definitely influenced monarchs and those who work for those monarchs, those reform-minded ministers that I had mentioned before, who were responsible for the suppression of the Jesuits, right? Then again, look at 62, another important text. We have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Social Contract. All right? So we have new ways of understanding of government. All right? And again, those ministers, whom I mentioned just before, reform-minded reformers, had these ideas very clear, and they tried to introduce a new kind of government. And that definitely was in contrast with the old ways of viewing government, which was represented by, as we call it, Ancien Régime. And the Jesuits were viewed as the symbol of the Ancien Regime. All right. So if these ministers were trying to introduce new ways of government, necessarily they were opposing the way the Jesuits conceived or represented Ancien Regime. Then we have Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. Again, you see this is 64, exactly the same year in which the Jesuits in France were suppressed. And again, we can argue to what extent Voltaire's writings influence that suppression in France. Finally, we have 1772, which is the first partition of Poland. Poland was divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria for the first time in 1772. And again, it is important. Why? Because once Catherine the Great, the Tsarina of the Russian Empire, occupied eastern Poland, what we call today Belarus and parts of Ukraine, some Jesuits became part of the Russian Empire. All right? And exactly this is where the Jesuits survived, which is another chapter of the history, something that obviously led then to the restoration of the society 200 years ago. All right? But this is exactly why some of the Jesuits could survive, and they did survive on the territory that suddenly became Russian territory in Belarus, what today is Belarus, or White Russia. All right, any questions to this chronology? I do think that the Enlightenment was an elite movement, but my point is that we can see how different monarchs were in touch with French philosophers. Think that Voltaire was a friend of Catherine the Great and of Frederick II of Prussia. Right? They corresponded. Okay? And actually, in a moment, I will show you a letter of Catherine the Great to Voltaire. All right? So that means that even though, again, people on the streets obviously did not probably know that the Enlightenment was happening, all right? But definitely the discussion on politics, right? Because again, philosophers were interested in reforming government, right? This is the term, the meaning of the term. These were not philosophers, right? But people who were engaged in trying to make changes in the way people understood or monarchs understood their role in society and in government. I think this is how they influenced, all right, those who were running the countries, monarchies, who decided eventually to suppress the Jesuits, all right. And I might imagine, obviously, that the people who were in the French Parliament were part of that. They knew what Voltaire or Rousseau were writing about. Does it make sense? All right. So here we go. Now, actually, because my voice is getting weaker and weaker, can I ask somebody to read that citation for us? Somebody with a strong voice? Tom, please. Thank you. All right. This is Catherine the Great. He was less than 20 years old at the time, writing to Voltaire. All right. And again, that following your question, right, that explains to some extent to what extent some monarchs were involved in the ideas that the French philosophers were proposing. Now, obviously, you know that there's a term enlightened despots, all right, which means which applies actually to Catherine the Great and Frederick II, because it meant that these two monarchs were extremely interested in maintaining their absolute power. Think of the way Catherine the Great treated the serfs. All right, so definitely that was not an enlightened idea of how she treated the serfs, linking them right to the Russian nobility forever. Yet they were interested, right, in listening and understanding what the philosophers were trying to do. Now, my point again will be, now we have some, well, Joseph II, again, of Austria can be considered an enlightened despot, right? King Poniatowski, a Polish king, was very interested in enlightened ideas, all right? So again, not every monarch would embrace these ideas, but these ideas were definitely powerful. Now, I would like, again, to contextualize that even more. Think of the English Enlightenment that began even a little bit earlier, in late 17th century, right? Think of John Locke. So we have 1690 treatises on government, all right? And we know that, and again, we're going to your question here. We might argue that definitely these Enlightenment ideas about government were very powerful, because if you look to the extent these ideas are present in the documents of the American Revolution of 1776, of the French Revolution that came a little bit later, 1789, and in Bolivar's movement in South America, well, the answer is so. Even though Enlightenment was an elitarian movement, yet it has an enormous impact on world politics. I mean, the United States would not have been born without the ideas of John Locke and of French philosophers as well. All right. So definitely, and that happened still in late 18th century, right? I mean, just exactly around the time when the Jesuits were suppressed. So my argument is, now some scholars are trying to say that the Enlightenment, because of its elitarian character, could not have so much impact on the Jesuit suppression. But my point is, if those ideas led American, French, and Latin American revolutionaries to make such drastic changes, well, so I think definitely these ideas were circulating and they were impacting at least those who were interested in politics. All right? Now, even though, as I mentioned, you might argue that some monarchs were not truly interested in making these reforms that the French philosophers offered, but if you look at those ministers, all right, reform-minded ministers that actually were running the governments, we have people who were absolutely interested and influenced by the Enlightenment. And we have Marquis Pombal in Portugal, and in a few minutes I will explain to what extent he was influenced by the Enlightenment. We have Duc de Choiseul, if that's the correct pronunciation. And how do you say it? All right, thank you. Then we had Conde de Aranda in Spain and Marchese Tanucci in Naples, right? All ministers, all right, who in lieu of the 7 Years' War, all right, are responsible for modernizing these governments, being able to collect taxes, because to wage wars in that period means being able to collect taxes to modernize the armies in order to be able to win battles. All right, and all these people are extremely influenced by the Enlightenment ideas, and I will show it with the example of Marquis Pombal, whom I studied a little bit more than the others. All right, and I have a quotation from O'Malley, upcoming new book, another one, John W. O'Malley. He wrote a short popular history of the Society of Jesus, which will be published very soon. And on Pombal, again, he said the following, and I must ask somebody to read it again.
So Pombal's action against the Jesuits must be explained on several levels. It fed his pride and ambition by showing he was able to bring down such an established institution. It enriched the crown through the seizure of the Jesuits' properties and institutions. For Pombal, a creature of the Enlightenment, the elimination of the Jesuits fit a larger plan to eradicate from the land the superstition that was Catholicism, and to humiliate the papacy by showing it was powerless to protect the Jesuits. His success had an impact far beyond Portugal and the Portuguese dominions. It demonstrated to Europe both the vulnerability of the supposedly powerful society of Jesus, the papacy's impotence to protect them.
All right. Pombal is on the left. On the right is a Jesuit, Gabriel Malagrida. And in the remainder of my presentation here, I will focus on these two personalities to show how the suppression worked in Portugal, in what context, and help us understand to what extent the historical context and the local context is important to understand why a local suppression in Portugal happened. Again, I could repeat the narrative that you guys can find on the suppression in France or in Spain, but again, I did some more research on Portugal, bringing up some new elements, and I would like to share them with you now. Such a spectacle of terror and amazement, as well as the desolation to beholders, as perhaps had not been equaled from the foundation of the world. Thus, an English merchant writing from Lisbon to a friend described the late dreadful earthquake which laid the capital of Portugal in ruins. On Sunday, 1st November 1755, the Catholic holiday of All Saints' Day. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755, known as Great Lisbon Earthquake, was followed by devastating fires and tsunami and became therefore one of the deadliest earthquakes in history. It devoured the lives of 10 to 15,000 people. Not only produced it many aftershocks in various parts of the world, but it also shook minds and consciences of many people of the age of reason, as the 18th century is used to be called. Notorious are echoes of the Lisbon natural catastrophe among Enlightenment philosophers. Voltaire's stylishly vicious anti-Jesuit novel Candide, and again you might remember when Candide goes to Lisbon, all right, he faces earthquake and its consequences. And the latter's, meaning Voltaire's correspondence with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as Immanuel Kant's 1756 articles on the subject. As Kenneth Maxwell pointed out, and I quote, "What was indeed new about the reaction to the Lisbon earthquake has not been recognized. For example, post-earthquake Portugal faced a virulent debate between those who saw the hand of God and attributed the disaster to retribution for past and present sins, and those who insisted earthquakes had natural causes." End of quote. Two most famous protagonists in this discussion were the Italian Jesuit missionary from Brazil, Gabriel Malagrida, born 1689, died 1771, and a philosopher/physician of Jewish origins, so-called New Christian, Antonio Núñez Ribeiro Sanchez, who who was born in 1699 and died in 1763, a close collaborator of Portugal's first minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Meio, born 1699, so the same year in which his friend was, and died 1782, better known to history as the Marquis de Pombal. The former published his sermon, meaning Malagrida, published his sermon entitled Juicio de verdadeira causa do terremoto in 1756, in which he claimed that, and I quote, are not comets, are not stars, are not vapors or exhalations, are not phenomena, they are not natural contingencies or causes, but they are solely our intolerable sins. End of quotation. The latter published a treatise, Considerações sobre os terremotos, in which he explained his and Pombal's views on the natural causes of earthquakes. And I quote, the force of vapor and the exhalations of the interior of the earth. End of quotation. The ideological collision between Malagrida and Ribeiro Sanchez was not only an expression of the conflict between Catholic and deist ideas about the relationship between God and the natural world, but also of a deeper animosity between Pombal, who ironically owed his career to the Jesuits at the royal court. By the way, you know obviously that Voltaire was also a student of the Jesuits in most famous college in Paris. And the Jesuits as a domestic yet foreign society within the Portuguese nation. I think this is one of the major issues that played a role in the suppression, that the Jesuits, like Jews, were conceived domestic yet foreign body. And we actually explored this topic last year. Tom was present at the conference at Boston College in 2012 when we describe this kind of correlation, even though not proportional, obviously, between Jews and Jesuits as the tragic couple. And we just published the proceedings of the conference with Brill. Portugal's most powerful statesman used the earthquake to destroy the Society of Jesus, whose impact on the religious, cultural, and political life of pre-earthquake Portugal was overwhelming. Gabriel Malagrida epitomized this influence and became a scapegoat for the alleged ills of the Portuguese pre-modern society. For almost 30 years, he was a renowned missionary in Brazil. So again, we go back to the famous reducciones in South America. They are known as Portuguese reducciones, but actually the territory included part of Brazil, part of Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, where the Jesuits created the famous reducciones, whose policy of economic independence from Lisbon, Pombal harshly opposed. And again, if you read Candide, you can hear the echoes of this. A few years before the earthquake, Malagrida was summoned to the royal court by King João V, who died in 1750, to whom he became a confessor and a consoler at his deathbed. So again, you see, Malagrida epitomizes all these images of a Jesuit because he is at the same time a confessor, right? So again, the traditional role the Jesuits played in Ancien Régime, right? As confessors and people very close to monarchs. He played the same role in the relation with Mariana of Austria, who died in 1754, the mother of the next king, José I of Portugal, who suppressed the Jesuits and who died eventually in 1777. Ominously to Malagrida, he was a confessor also to a potent noble family of Tavora, which was accused by Pombal of orchestrating a plot to assassinate the king in 1758, just 3 years after the earthquake. Using the alleged inclination of the Jesuits towards the doctrine of regicide, so again, another myth. Think of Juan de Mariana's De Rege et Regis Institutione, which he published in 1599, in which he considered a possibility of killing the monarch if he did not represent the will of the people, and the assassination of Henry IV by François Ravaillac, the presumed pupil of the French Jesuits. Malagrida was thrown into the dungeons of the Tower of Belém with some other Jesuits and declared guilty of lesa majestas, but exempted from secular jurisdiction, could not be executed. All right, so again, we have a conflict of powers here, which again we'll see what kind of role it will play. In prison, Malagrida allegedly composed 2 treatises, Antichrist and the Heroic and Wonderful Life of the Glorious St. Anne, filled with unorthodox obsession with Mary's mother's womb. In the meantime, Pombal manipulated the transformation of the Inquisition, founded 3 centuries earlier with the support of the Jesuits. Actually, Ignatius of Loyola was directly involved in the creation of the Portuguese Inquisition, right? Which was exceptional, actually, into a secular tribunal, the head of which he appointed his own brother, Paulo de Carvalho de Mendoza. Now, Pombal was able to surreptitiously make Malagrida declare a heretic. As a result, Father Malagrida was strangled and burned in a public auto da fe. And again, if you go back to Candide, you see the auto da fe, 21st of September 1761. His ashes were thrown into the Tagus River, and even to Voltaire, the burning of the old and perhaps mad Jesuit, ironically, the last victim of the Portuguese Inquisition, was preposterous. And I quote, "The excess of the ridiculous and absurd is here joined to the excess of horror." This is Voltaire. Malagrida's opponent in the discussion over the causes of the Lisbon earthquake, Antonio Núñez Ribeiro Sanchez, was not less illustrious. He was a member of a Portuguese merchant family of Jewish ancestry. He studied law at the Jesuit University in Coimbra and earned his doctorate in medicine from the University of Salamanca. Accused of Judaizing in 1726 and at any rate not being able to exercise his profession for being a new Christian based on the purity of blood laws, something that I discuss how they were incorporated into the Jesuit legislation in a book that was mentioned at the beginning. Ribeiro Sanchez escaped to England, where he decided to get circumcised, but he eventually abandoned Judaism. Subsequently, he served as a physician at the courts of enlightened despots of Russia and Prussia. Right? So again, you see how him being the physician to Catherine the Great and Frederick II, how he could share the ideas of the philosophers with Pombal and with others at the court, the Portuguese court. And also the editors of the Enlightenment Encyclopedia invited him to collaborate in the project. To Pombal, it must have been not too difficult to persuade Ribeiro Sanchez to contrast the Jesuit Malagrida's interpretation of the causes of the Lisbon earthquake, not only because of his enlightenment over reliance on reason, but also because he believed the Jesuits were responsible for the introduction of the purity of blood laws in Portugal, which affected him personally. Indeed, he stated so expressly in his manuscript notes on the Inquisition from 1758 that are conserved in the National Library of Madrid. Even though he substituted the word Jesuits with 2 asterisks, the context of the document undoubtedly indicates that he refers in it to the Society of Jesus. A reference to an episode of the election of the successor of the Jesuit Superior General after the death of Francisco de Borja in 1573, in which the Portuguese Jesuits sabotaged the election of the candidate of Jewish origins, Juan Alfonso de Polanco, is indeed confirmed by the archival documents that I brought to light in my recent book on the topic. Apparently, Ribeiro Sanchez, who had already authored a treatise on the distinction between the Old and New Christians in Portugal, provided Pombal with an additional reason to suppress the order in Portugal and in its overseas territories, which indeed took place in 1759 and led to the suppression of the Society of Jesus worldwide in 1773, the very year in which Pombal abolished in Portugal the distinction between the Old and New Christians, except for the territories of Catherine the Great, a friend of both Voltaire and Ribeiro Sanchez. In conclusion, the Lisbon earthquake sheds light on the relationship between natural catastrophe and religion because of the complex and diverse manifestations it produced at the dawn of the birth of modern societies, just in between the Ancien Regime and the Enlightenment, when religious and secular worldviews, or the combination of the two, began to clash more intensely. And I believe this is a context in which we must see the process of the suppression of the Society of Jesus, first in Portugal, then in France, in Spain, and finally worldwide in 1773. Thank you very much. And I will be very happy to entertain any questions you might have. We know, yes, that Voltaire was in discussion with Leibniz, right, exactly about this view, right, that everything has a reason. So even an earthquake that causes so much death, right, must be justified. And this is the refrain of Candide, right? This is the point. This is the point that Voltaire is making. But I think that the context of Portugal shows us to what extent the philosophers were able, even though they were aware, that they had, weak sides, that the French, especially the French philosophers, were able to create a myth of a Jesuit like Malagrida, right, who could not understand any scientific understanding or explanation of processes, all right? So that was an attempt to portray that the Jesuits represent a different period, right, of history, that they belong to Ancien Regime again, and they are unable to be in dialogue with modern science, which is not true. And if you think that, well, already a couple of Jesuits were investigating actually the natural causes of earthquakes, including Boscovich, who was a major Jesuit thinker of the 18th century. But subsequently, Jesuits became the first to found seismological observatories around the world. So this is really very, ironic, extremely ironic. But again, that shows us that the philosophers were able to manipulate the public opinion, all right, and then to convince that the typical Jesuits was like Malagrida, who cannot understand any kind of scientific explanation of natural processes. When Cacambo goes to the Paraguayan missions, and there's a portrayal of the Jesuits eating, and what kind of silverware he's using, right? So all it's, gold, and because again, one of the myths that was created by Pombal that, well, the Jesuits were defending the Guaranis against Portugal and Spain after the Treaty of Madrid because they were hiding gold. All right? That was one of the myths that was created. Even Clement XIV allowed some visitors in the Roman seminary, which was a lay priest seminary that the Jesuits ran in Rome, again to look for some hidden funds. Okay, so that was a part again. Now, for Pombal, that was clear. If Pombal, as an enlightened minister, right, if his idea was to create a secular educational system, all right, obviously he looked at the society because the educational system in Europe, in Catholic Europe at least, and especially in Portugal, was dominated by the Jesuit schools, right? So obviously by suppressing the Jesuits, he would acquire the wealth of schools and colleges that the Jesuits ran. So that was definitely part of the plan. But again, partly manipulated. Even Lorenzo Ricci, the superior general, when he was already a prisoner at the St. Angelo Castle, again, the investigation was to look for some enormous funds which could not be found eventually. So you're definitely right that this is part of it. Now, again, look, why Catherine the Great allowed the Jesuits to stay? Not only because she just didn't want to obey the Pope, so she, as an Orthodox Christian, even though, as you know, she was a daughter of a Protestant prince, but she converted to Orthodoxy. And, well, her plan, again, I think, which was a kind of influence of the French Enlightenment, was a creation of a secular educational system in Russia. Now, because there was nothing before in Russia, because the Jesuits could not run schools in an Orthodox country, so she used the Society of Jesus to reform the educational system of Russia. So she not only allowed them to stay in Polotsk. Polotsk was a college, the major college in Belarus, and actually she gave, or her successor, her son, gave it the rights of a university. So it ran a museums, printing press. It was called the Athens of the East in late 18th century. But her successor opened a college in St. Petersburg, all right, which again ended badly because some of the Orthodox students began converting to Catholicism, among them a son of the Minister of Education of Russia, and that was the end of the Jesuits in 1820, until the fall of communism. Right, the Jesuits were prohibited doing any kind of ministry in Russia, then Soviet Union subsequently. So that's again, it shows, and we could analyze also the case of Frederick II, that the Jesuits portrayed as bad teachers those who could not actually be serious about modern education of the 18th century was a myth, okay? Because Catherine the Great used them. Frederick the Great did not want to suppress them initially because he admired the Jesuit work in education, all right? And if you analyze the Polish Enlightenment, all right, 90% of the new Ministry of Education that was created in Poland as the first secular Ministry of Education, 90% of the people sitting were ex-Jesuits. So again, it's a complex story, but the element you mentioned is definitely one of the most important. Yes, if you read Redemptor Ac Dominus, the suppression brief, right, which is very long, tedious to read, 45 paragraphs. But one of the points that actually Clement XIV makes is that from the very beginning, the Society of Jesus was engaged in various conflicts with universities, because consider, Jesuits were expelled still during the life of Ignatius from France, okay, for some time, because the university, the Sorbonne, did not want the competition, but also because they considered the Jesuits very unorthodox. And so we have the conflict with universities, and we have conflicts now, as you pointed out, with other orders, especially with the Dominicans. Right? That is from the very beginning. You know that the strongest opposition to the spiritual exercises of Ignatius came from the Dominicans, especially Melchior Cano, who was viciously anti-Jesuit. All right. And again, the story is complex because the second generation of Jesuits came from the masters of the School of Salamanca. All right? So the pillars of Jesuit philosophy, such as Francisco Suarez, Molina, and others, they were disciples of the Dominican masters from the School of Salamanca. Right? So there was a Francisco... his name, Toledo, the first Jesuit cardinal and very prominent theologian at the Roman College. So they were influenced by the Dominicans, but there were some, like Melchior Cano, who viciously opposed the spiritual exercises because they accused them of being a product of the Alumbrado movement. And Ignatius was accused, because of his contacts in Alcala during his studies, of being, and he was in contact with many Alumbrados, and some of the Jesuits who supported that movement actually eventually entered the society, including his confessor. So this conflict, and then, as you know, there is, at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th, there's a big conflict known as the Auxilies conflict with the Dominicans, where the question was the free will, right? The Jesuits were accused of highlighting too much the human element in the relationship with God, and Jansenists actually accused the Jesuits of being Pelagian, if not at least semi-Pelagian. But the Jesuits would respond that, well, Jansenists were like Calvinists, because they would almost entirely trust in God's will and the subjugation of the human will to God's will. So there was a long conflict, all right? So definitely, and in the words of Clement XIV himself, actually that led to the explosion of this anti-Jesuit atmosphere in mid-18th century. But according to him, that was growing. And one of the reasons was, as I mentioned before, and we can go back to the very first, to the long-run causes, right? The Jesuit Institute. As you know, the Jesuit Institute encountered opposition in the Roman Curia to be approved because it offered a very revolutionary way of religious life. Okay? Not wearing a prescribed garb, not singing in choir. These were elements that shocked other religious order, especially. All right? So the opposition was from the very beginning, and I think, well, obviously then it was highlighted or manipulated to show. And these are the words of the suppression brief, that if you want to maintain peace in the Catholic Church, the Jesuits have to be out. That's the only reason that is explicitly said in the suppression brief.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.